The sum of all these reflections leads us to the concept of the Supreme Being. This Supreme Being embraces within itself everything which can be sought by man when he, a creature made of dust, dares to cast a spying eye behind the curtain which veils from mortal eyes the mysteries of the inscrutable. God is all sufficient. Whatever exists, whether it be possible or actual, is only something in so far as it is given through him. If it be permitted to translate the communings of the infinite with himself into human language, we may imagine God addressing himself in these terms. I am from eternity to eternity. Apart from me there is nothing, except it be through me. This thought, of all thoughts the most sublime, is still widely neglected, and mostly not considered at all. That which is to be found in the possibilities of things and which is capable of realizing perfection and beauty in excellent schemes, has been regarded as a necessary object of divine wisdom, but not itself as a consequence of this incomprehensible being. The dependency of other things has been limited to their existence alone. As a result of this limitation, a large share in the ground of so many perfections has been taken away from that supreme nature and invested in I know not what eternal absurdity. Immanuel Kant. In my lecture on reason, I explained that to Kant, reason is that faculty of our thinking which desires something absolute, which desires a totality, a maximum in thinking, which always, if given something conditioned, which always desires the last, or rather the first condition, which itself is without condition. And I explained how this nature of reason leads to reason coming up with certain ideas, that is, concepts of a maximum. And it is these ideas of the soul and its immortality, of freedom, of God, it is these ideas which metaphysics deals with. However, I also explained in the lecture on dialectic that according to Kant, reason in this, when trying to understand its ideas and to prove the reality of its ideas, reason becomes dialectical. Dialectic to Kant meaning the doctrine of illusion. That is to say, reason creates wrong arguments, not sophistical arguments about whose errors we are conscious and which we use to fool other people deliberately, but rather wrong arguments that seem to be true to us and through which we fool ourselves. Because the great insight of the whole critique of pure reason is that we cannot really transcend experience with our reason. We cannot really venture into the realm of the supersensual. We can make synthetic judgments a priori, that is, judgments that are not based on experience, that, so to say, come before experience, but they still have to be about experience. That is, I can say a priori how my experience will turn out. I can name some general rules, some general principles that all experience must follow. For example, I can know before something will be viewed by me that I will view it in time and space, because those are conditions of the possibility of something being viewed by me. But I cannot, with synthetic judgments a priori, go beyond experience into the realm of the supersensual. Now, if that is true, that I cannot transcend experience with my reason. My reason becomes dialectic if it tries to transcend experience. But at the same time, my reason, by its nature, desires something absolute, and something absolute cannot be possibly experienced. Even if it exists, in experience, I can only experience limited and conditional things. Then, out of these three premises, it follows that reason becomes dialectical when dealing with its own ideas. And you could say that the whole critique of pure reason was written by Kant with the intent of showing this natural dialectic of reason, and of showing this illusion that reason creates for us, and putting an end to it, putting an end to metaphysicians falling for this illusion. And this is what Kant is doing with all the areas, with all the fields of the metaphysics of his time. And I already made 2 lectures about that, where I talked about how Kant deals with rational psychology, the field of metaphysics which deals with the idea of the soul. And I made a lecture about how Kant deals with rational cosmology, the field of metaphysics which deals with the idea of the world as a whole, and therefore also the idea of freedom, that is, the idea of not being completely dependent on the natural laws that are in place in this world, but being able to stop my own chain of causality. And well, that leaves us with one last field, the field of rational theology, or the field that deals with the idea of God. And it is, however, a very specific idea of God that Kant deals with. It is not the God of existence, it is the God of possibility that he is concerned with first or foremost, you could say. And I think that is something that is not stressed enough usually. Then people talk about what Kant writes about the attempted proofs for God. And that is something that I think most people also don't catch when reading Kant. Maybe because it's a bit harder to understand, and maybe because it's a somewhat unusual thought, and maybe because Kant here is much deeper than the regular metaphysicians of his time, who only talked about the God of existence, not the God of possibility, and also much deeper than most that came after him, which who also didn't really understand what Kant was saying here. What does it mean? What is the God of existence and the God of possibility? Well, usually we may start from noting that things exist. There's a world of existing things. And if you believe in a God, you probably believe that God is the reason of existence. Why is there a world that exists and not rather nothing? Because God made it so. Because God decided to create this world, right? And so the existence of things would depend on God's will. If God had wanted, he could also have made other things exist. He could have created a different world, right? There's usually the belief that there is an infinite number of possible worlds that may not exist, but they could exist. Like, there's no reason why it shouldn't be possible for a world where, I don't know, the leaves on the trees are not green but purple, or where unicorns exist. or where there's a second moon or whatever. It is not the case because, once again, if you're a believer, because God didn't want it to be the case, but it could have been the case. There was a lot of talk in the 18th century of possible worlds. Like, for example, Leibniz famously had talked about God creating the best of all possible worlds. So that means that God, before creating the world, looked at the whole infinite number of possible worlds, and out of all possible worlds there were, since he is good, he picked the one that was best. Meaning, there are also other worlds that potentially he could have picked and created, right? He didn't, because they were worse than the one he did pick, but he could have picked them. So this is the God of existence, and if you try a cosmological proof of God, which is probably what most lay people, if trying to prove God, would do, it will lead you to this God of existence, right? So a cosmological proof of God would start not from God himself, but rather it would start with the world. A cosmological proof would say, well, things exist, there's a world, and this world needs to exist for a reason, needs to have a starting point, so to say. So therefore, there must be a God who came before the world and who created this world, who caused this world, who caused the Big Bang to happen, maybe. Now, this is probably the most common argument you will hear for God, and this would be a cosmological argument. And this, therefore, Kant doesn't deal with just in the rational theology, but he already addressed it in a way in rational cosmology. And I talked about it, therefore, in the previous lecture. I said that rational cosmology has these four antinomies, and the fourth of them is exactly dealing with this argument. In the fourth antinomy, the thesis was that since everything in the world is contingent and dependent on something else as its condition, since it is not of absolute necessity, like it doesn't have to exist, but rather only of relative necessity, it only has to exist if something else exists, then therefore there must be something which does have absolute necessity and on which all the the contingent things depend for its existence. Now, as I explained in the last lecture, this is an argument that doesn't work. For one, even if you could prove that, yes, there must be something necessary, that's not saying that necessary being must be God. It could also be the world itself. You could say that the world, or that the matter out of which the world is made up, is the necessary being. But you can't even prove that. You can't even prove that there is such a thing as a necessary being. All you can really say is that there being a necessary being in the supersensual, in the intelligible world, doesn't contradict that everything in the sensible world might still be contingent. Both could be true at the same time, and therefore there's maybe room, if we were given a good reason to, there's maybe room for belief in such a necessary being beyond the world. But it can't be proven, and again, even if it could, it doesn't necessarily have to be God. It could also be the world itself. But anyways, even if you could prove a necessary being, and even if you could prove that it was God, this cosmological God, we try to prove by saying, well, the world must have a cause. That which exists must have walked from possibility into existence by someone, by a God. Even then, that God would just be the God of existence, the God who made, well, the things that exist. But now something that most people will not reflect on is the question, why are things even possible? Like, when we are saying that there's an infinite number of possible worlds that God could have created, and he chose this one and made this world exist, while other worlds he chose not to exist. Why were they possible in the first place? Why, even if they do not exist, could they exist? Why, even if God didn't make them exist, why could he have made them? That's a question that usually is not asked, because we just take possibility sort of for granted, right? We just think that we can think of all sorts of things. We can think of unicorns, or we can think of the sky being red and the leaves being purple or whatever. And we don't ever stop to answer the question, why? Why can we even think of that as a possibility when it is not real? We usually seem to think that only the existing things need a reason why they exist, why they were walked from possibility into existence. But actually, Kant says, even the possible needs a reason why it is possible, and not rather impossible. And if that reason for something being possible was somehow outside of God, then that would mean that God is not unlimited, and it would mean that God is dependent, because that would mean that out of thousands or billions of possible worlds, God maybe had the freedom and the power to choose which one to bring into existence, but still the choices out of which he could choose were given to him from outside, and he didn't have the ability to choose creating a world which, as a possibility, was not given to him. Then that wouldn't really be God, right? That sort of God would be a limited God. It would be a mere creator God. In philosophy, you would maybe describe such a God as a demiurge, which is basically the Greek word for a craftsman. So that God would be a craftsman, a builder, building a world, having the power to create a world, but still in what he could build, he would depend on something else. And that is precisely the idea of God that mere cosmology will give you. So once again, if you start from the world, from that which exists, and if you just use the cosmological argument, there needs to be someone who has walked this world into existence, then you only get a God who is only responsible for existence, not for possibility. So you only get such a craftsman, such a demiurge. Now that means that for a proper idea of God, the reason for possibility cannot lie outside God, it must be within God. So to Kant, God is not just he who created existence. God is even he who, in a way, created possibility. But he is the reason of both of those in different ways. Because existence is made through God's will. Out of all the possible things, God wants one world to exist and others he doesn't want to exist. Now, possibility cannot depend on God's will. it wouldn't make sense for God to say, this is something I don't want to exist, but I want it to be able to exist. I want it to be possible. And if he didn't say that, then it would be impossible. But that would mean that before it became possible, it was already possible for it to become possible. Or else God could not have made it possible through his will. So this doesn't make sense, clearly. Therefore, Kant says that the possibility of things, it doesn't depend on God's will, it depends on God's being or on God's essence. So things are possible because of the way God is. Like, God is unlimited, he is almighty. And everything that this almightiness allows for is possible because the almightiness, by its very essence, by what almightiness is, allows for it. So that is the difference. God is the reason of existence through his will, through wanting to create it. But first of all, he is the reason of possibility through his essence, through simply his nature, so to say, allowing for certain things to be possible and not allowing for other things to be possible. And here in this lecture, I only want to talk about the latter. I only want to talk about this God of possibility. This is also why I can be a little more brief here. Because Kant already, like you will hear often that in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant showed the errors in all proofs for God that had previously been attempted in philosophy. And that is true. But you will not hear so often is that Kant already did that even in his pre-critical time. Like, he wrote an earlier text many years before the Critique of Pure Reason, where he already realized and showed the errors in the common proofs for God. But these common proofs for God only attempted to prove the God of existence, the God that through his will had created the world out of many possible worlds. This God, Kant showed even before the Critique of Pure Reason, this God cannot be proven. How exactly he did that, what proofs for God there are, and how Kant disproved them, I don't want to address that here in this lecture. I will get into that at a later point when I talk about Kant's philosophy of religion. But what Kant attempted in this earlier text of his, before the Critique of Pure Reason, was to say, well, this God of existence cannot be proven. The only possible proof that could be attempted for God would be a proof that shows that God is necessary not just to explain existence, but he is necessary even to explain possibility. And in his pre-critical time, while Kant was already dissatisfied with the earlier attempted proofs for God by other philosophers, he still believed that through this way you could maybe prove God. But then he realized that this way also doesn't work, and he showed the error in this. And this is what I want to focus on here in this lecture. Because once again, I think it's quite important and quite deep in a way, but it's also something that is usually overlooked when people are dealing with Kant. So, how would you prove this God of possibility? Or what exactly does Kant even mean by it? Like, how does God, through his mere essence, how is he the reason for possibility? Well, in order to answer that, you should turn to Kant's table of the categories of our thinking, about which I already made a lecture. And you should turn to the categories of quality, that is, reality, negation, and limitation. Kant says these are the only three possible ways to think of qualities, that is, to think of the attributes of things. Like I can say, in my t-shirt, the red color has reality because my t-shirt is red. Or I can say, in my t-shirt, the blue color has no reality. The blue color is being negated, therefore. Well, what Kant notes here is that all negation depends on reality. Because negation is not its own thing. It's just the absence of something, of a reality. And you cannot talk about the absence of something without first having a concept of that something. Like, for example, a blind person who was born blind has no concept of darkness, because darkness is not its own positive thing. Darkness is just an absence, a lack of light. Now, the blind person may live in a permanent lack of light, but precisely because it is permanent, because he never experienced light, he doesn't really know what absence of light means, and therefore he has no real concept of darkness. Likewise, Kant likes to say that the savage has no concept of poverty. Like, a savage may not wear clothes, and he may live out in the forest and not have a house, not have running water, not have a roof over his head. He may have to hunt for his own food, but he will probably not feel like he's poor and like he is lacking some sort of luxury, because he doesn't know any other life. Now, if you, in our society, if you become homeless, then you will probably have a concept of the fact that you are poor, because you know what wealth, on the other hand, means. This is also why, as Kant says, you need a lot of knowledge, and you need to get deeply into science before, like Socrates, you can say, I know that I know nothing. I mean, this is a common issue, right? That many people don't realize how little they know. And the more you know, the more you study, the more you learn, the deeper you get into a science or in some area of knowledge, the more you will realize how much knowledge you are actually lacking and how little you really know, how surface level and superficial all your knowledge is. But you can only say that, you can only talk about this negation because you first have a concept of a reality which you are now negating. You can't negate something if there is no something. Now, when it comes to the world around us that we experience, Kant says usually we don't actually experience full reality, but rather what we experience is always limitation. That is, it is always a limited reality. So, for example, I can of course say that a lamp that is turned on this lamp, light has a reality, brightness has a reality. But then if I think about it, I realize that it's not full brightness that has reality here. It is just a part, just a fraction of brightness which has reality here. Because, of course, the lamp is not the brightest thing that could possibly exist. I can imagine the lamp being as bright as the sun. And even if it was as bright as the sun, if compared to other stars, is actually not all that bright. There are other stars which might be way brighter. So I could still imagine more brightness. And of course, there may be a limit to my actual experience. Like, if something gets too bright, it will just blind me and I cannot experience even more brightness. But still, at least in thinking, I can always imagine the brightness increasing, and there will never be a maximum, right? Even when I get to the brightest thing in the whole universe, there will not be a thing in existence that is brighter, but there will be a possible thing that is brighter. That is, I can at least imagine something that is even more bright. And the same goes for every reality, right? I can say, if I cook for myself, I can say my food is warm. But I mean, it's not the warmest thing that exists. I can imagine a red hot iron, which is much warmer. And that's also not the hottest thing. I can imagine the core of the earth, which is much warmer. And then I can imagine the sun, which is even warmer. And again, the sun is not that warm as a star. There are other warmer stars, and so on. And even the warmest thing in the universe is only the hottest thing in existence, but not the hottest possible thing, not the hottest thing that can be conceived of. Or for a last example, if I think of knowledge, I can, of course, meet people that have some sort of knowledge, and I can meet people that know more than others. But even when I meet the person on earth who knows the most, who has more knowledge than everyone else, if I reflect about it, I will realize that that person is probably not all-knowing. Meaning his knowledge has some sort of limitation, and it is at least possible to imagine someone who has more knowledge. So all the realities that we encounter in the world are actually not full-on realities. They are limited realities. Well, and now every limitation, Kant says, is really just a combination of reality and negation, right? That is what limitation means. It means partial reality and partial negation. So, for example, when I say someone has knowledge, but he is not all-knowing, then what I'm saying is some knowledge has reality in this person, and some other knowledge is negated in that person, right? So, for example, me, I'm pretty knowledgeable about Kant. I've read all 29 volumes of Kant's collected works. So the knowledge of Kant's philosophy has reality in me. But then there are other philosophers, let's say Spinoza, which I haven't read completely. I may have some knowledge about them still, but not as much as about Kant. I have not read every single word that Spinoza has ever written. So you could say that in me that Kant knowledge has reality, but some of that possible Spinoza knowledge is negated. But you can only say the latter, you can only say that it is negated because you can imagine it having reality, right? Again, you can only negate a reality. So there can be no negation without at least thinking of reality. So I can think of someone who, like I've read all the works of Kant, has read all the works of Spinoza. Maybe someone like that actually exists, but even if there is no person alive like that, there could at least be a person like that. And only because I can imagine such a person can I judge that I am not that person. I don't have that full Spinoza knowledge. So, in that way, everything that we encounter is a limitation. Every limitation contains negation. Every limitation is actually a reality that is partially negated. But every negation, again, first needs reality in order that we can negate that reality. And that means, Kant says, that for us to experience something as limited, we must, with our reason, have an ideal of something which is unlimited. we must have an ideal, and Kant would say that every person, every human being has this ideal. It is a necessary creation of our reason. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is conscious of that ideal. It might be an unconscious ideal most of the time, but still it is an ideal we have. And I talked in the lecture on what is reason, I talked about what an ideal is. There I said that reason comes up with ideas, these concepts of reason that are concepts of a maximum, like the idea of justice or the idea of goodness. And I said that an ideal is that idea being realized in one concrete individual, like the idea of justice being realized in the ideal just utopian state, or the idea of goodness being realized in the ideal holy person, in someone like Jesus. And well, here we have an ideal of pure reason, which Kant calls the ideal of the most real being, or in Latin, the ens realissimum. So our reason comes up with this ideal of one being which has all the reality, and no reality is negated, even in the slightest, in that being. So that being is not limited in any way, but it has the full reality, all the possible reality. And that most real being, or Kant also says the being of beings, the ens entium in Latin, that being, of course, would be God. This would be a being which in it contains all the realities, so that every other being in comparison could be understood as a limited form of that most real being, as a being which to some degree, some more, some less so, but to some degree has less reality than that most real being, right? So again, let's go with knowledge. When you judge someone to be knowledgeable, you are saying that knowledge has some reality in that person. But when you judge that this person is not all-knowing, when you judge that no matter how much knowledge that person has, he doesn't have all the knowledge that one could possibly have. When you judge that it would, at least potentially, be possible to know more than this person does, then you need, Kant says, in order to make that judgment, you need to have a concept of someone who knows more, of someone in whom there's more reality of knowledge. And again, if you say this possible someone who knows more still doesn't know everything, so I can again think of someone else who knows even more, you can only do that if you have a concept of that reality of the extra knowledge. And that means that in the end, you need to, at least unconsciously, have a concept of someone being all-knowing. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible for you to say that this specific person in front of you does not know everything, and that it is possible to know more than this person. You can only make that statement if you actually have a concept of that more. And therefore, since everything in the world that we experience is limited, in order to experience it at all, and in order to realize that it is limited, that we can at least think of its reality increasing, we must have this ideal of the most real being. We, so to say, compare every being that we encounter with our ideal of the most real being, and we understand everything as being the most real being minus x, so to say. So the most real being with some of its reality, probably lots of its reality, being negated. So if I encounter, let's go with another attribute of God, with his almightiness, if I encounter someone who has power, even if it's the most powerful person on earth, I will probably judge that I could at least imagine someone with more power. This person in front of me doesn't have all the possible power, so it would, at least in theory, be possible to have more power than that person. How can I make that judgment? How can I know that more power is possible, at least as a thought, even if not in existence? Like maybe the laws of nature prevent a human being from having more power than this person in front of me, but at least in thought, I could say more power is possible. How do I know that? Only because I have an ideal of an all-powerful being in which power has full and unlimited reality, in which power is not negated in the slightest. And now I compare this person in front of me with that all-powerful being, and I say that, okay, so and so much power of that all-powerful being, so and so much of the reality of its power is negated in that person. That person has something in common with the all-powerful being, like it shares some degree of its power, but he doesn't have the full same degree of power. He has a lesser degree of power. And in that way, again, God, not through his will, which decides what to bring into existence and what to not bring into existence, but simply through his through his very essence as being the most real being, the ens realissimum, is the reason and the condition of all possibility in the world. And if there was no such God, if there was no most real being, then not only would there not be a world that exists, because God didn't make it exist, but rather there would not even be a world that possibly could exist. Again, we usually don't think of possibility that way. We just take possibility for granted. We would usually say that even if there was no world, even if there was only nothing and pure emptiness, one could still think of a world. One could still make the statement, well, there is, for example, no person who has knowledge right now because there's nothing. But a person with knowledge can still be thought of and therefore could potentially exist. That is still a statement that could be made if there was nothing. At least it could be made if there was someone in that nothing who could make any statements and who could make any judgments. Or like if there was nothing, we imagine that we could still make the judgment, okay, there is no power because there is no one who has power, but we can at least imagine someone having power. So it would at least be possible for a being with power existing. But what Kant is saying is that no, if there was nothing, so not just no world, if there was no God, no most real being, then there would not even be possibility for us to judge that it would be possible for someone to have knowledge or for someone to have some measure of power, even in an empty universe where there is no actual person with knowledge or with power. For us to be able to make that judgment, we already need to have the ideal of absolute knowledge or of absolute power. And only then can we think of limited knowledge or limited power by taking this ideal of the most real being and limiting it, subtracting from it, so to say. That would be the argument for God here. Once again, reason, when transcending experience, is a dialectical concept, so it creates wrong argument. When it comes to the idea of the soul, the wrong arguments are paralogisms, so formally wrong conclusions through which reason fools itself, but through which reason fools itself always in one and the same way. That is, always fools itself into believing in spiritualism, into believing in the reality of a spiritual soul, which is independent of the body and immortal. When it comes to the idea of the world, when it comes to rational cosmology, the dialectic arguments that reason creates are antinomies. That is, here reason doesn't just fool itself in one manner, but rather here reason gets into a conflict with itself, because there's always a thesis making one claim and an antithesis making the opposite claim, and reason proves or disproves both of them, and thereby is in contradiction with itself. Well, here, in the third case, in rational theology, when it comes to the idea of God, Kant says here the wrong argument is not a paralogism, that is formally wrong, and it is also not an antinomy where my reason contradicts itself, but rather it is a dialectical ideal of reason, the ideal of the most real being. One difference, however, here is that in the other two cases, there were always four wrong arguments. There were four paralogisms about the soul, and there were four antinomies about the world, always according to the table of categories, which has these four titles of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Here, when it comes to God, Kant says there's only one ideal of the most real being. And that is because, well, it is the most real being. It is the absolute maximum of everything. There can't be more to it, so there can't be different kinds of it. And this being is supposed to be not just the condition of what exists, but the condition of possibility. And well, the table of categories with its 12 pure intellectual concepts, those are the 12 categories of our thinking of things, that is, our thinking of possible things. So you could say that this ideal of the most real being comes before the categories and is the condition even of the categories. And therefore it can't be divided into several ideals according to the categories, but rather it's just one. I want to talk here a bit about the place of this ideal in Kant's architectonic, because I already gave another lecture about Kant's architectonic method, and Kant is a very architectonic and systematic thinker. And I always want to stress this, because I believe that you can only truly understand him thoroughly and only truly appreciate his thought once you grasp this architectonic of his. But unfortunately, I also find that usually when people are dealing with Kant and talking about Kant, it gets neglected or only mentioned in passing. So I want to point out that our intellect, as I addressed in previous lectures, our intellect, when trying to get to cognition, trying to get to experience, our intellect does 3 acts in the process of cognition. And these three acts are apperception, apprehension, and what doesn't really get a proper name in Kant's writings, but what you could call intellection. So I talked about all of those previously. I said that apperception is what creates a subject, because apperception is the act of synthesizing all our representations into being the representations of us, of one subject, of an I. And then apprehension is what creates an object that you can perceive, a sensual object, because apprehension is the power of imagination, but directed by the intellect, the power of imagination taking up, apprehending the sensual impressions into itself, into the power of imagination, so that an image can be created out of them, so that they can be synthesized into an image which we can perceive. And lastly, there is what you could call intellection, and what I addressed in my 2 lectures on what is experience and what is the intellect. That is, we now have a subject, and we have an object being perceived by that subject. But now we need to understand that object. We need to understand what that object is. And that is the process of intellection, where the intellect uses its concepts, applies its concepts to the perceived objects, comes up with concepts in order to understand the objects, and also in order to connect various perceptions into one experience, because they can only be connected into a systematic experience through concepts, through our categories, like causality, like saying they depend on each other in a causal relationship. Well, that is what the intellect does. The intellect, which is dealing with the sensual, with the sense impressions, and which is bringing synthetic unity into the sense impressions. Now, as I said previously, the faculty of reason is sort of a higher intellect, which is not dealing with sensuality directly, but which is dealing with the intellect, and which, like the intellect, is bringing synthetic unity into sensuality, which in turn is bringing synthetic unity into the intellect and into our thinking. And therefore, and I already mentioned that in the lecture on the dialectic, therefore the 3 ideas of our reason are just these 3 acts, these 3 synthetic unities of the intellect taken up by reason and imagined as a maximum. So the act of synthesizing the representations in one subject leaves reason to imagine the soul as the absolute subject, which is not dependent on something else, but which is an independent, immaterial subject. And apprehension, the act of synthesizing an object which can be perceived, leads reason to imagine absolute apprehension, which leads reason to sort of imagine everything, all possible objects being apprehended, the sum of all objects, that is the world. And lastly, when we turn to intellection and when we talk about our concepts, this is where we get the idea of God. And I said in the lecture on the dialectic that maybe it's not immediately obvious why the idea of God is connected to the intellection, is connected to not the subject that perceives and experiences and thinks, and not the object that is perceived and experienced, but rather the concept which the subject is making for itself about the object in order to understand the object. But maybe now it becomes more clear. This God of possibility, as I have called him, this God is not a thing, neither a subject nor an object. It is a thought, it is a concept, but it is sort of the ultimate concept. It is the concept of the most real being. And every other concept, since it is the concept of a being of limited reality, is sort of derived and deduced from that one absolute concept. Every other concept is sort of, once again, that absolute concept minus X. One other way to look at this idea and its place in the architectonic, and one way to maybe understand it even better, is if you remember that these three metaphysical ideas, they are related to the three categories or also the three judgments of relation. And here you should go back to my lectures on the table of judgments and the table of categories. When it comes to these three categories, the first one was that of subsistence and inherence. And this is connected to the idea of the soul, because reason thinks of the soul as being something that is an absolute substance and not an accident of another substance. Reason thinks of the soul as not being a mere attribute of my body, of my brain. Reason thinks of my mind as something which is not in my brain and caused by my brain, but rather reason thinks of the soul as being its own substance, its own immaterial substance, completely independent of the body. And when you turn to the second category, you have causality. And here, when reason is seeking, as it always does, the absolute, it comes up with the idea of freedom, because freedom means thinking of an absolute causality. If I'm free, then I can be the cause of something else. I can start my own chain of causality, but I am an uncaused cause. I am a cause on which other things depend, but which itself doesn't depend on other earlier causes. And the idea of God then would belong to the third category, to the category of community, or of the whole and its parts. And I previously said in the lecture on the dialectic that maybe it's not so immediately obvious how this idea relates to this category. And I said that when I will talk about this, it will hopefully become more clear. And well, that is now. And I hope that now it can become more clear. Most people would maybe think about this in a more naive and superficial way, and would imagine that the idea of God would belong to the second category of relation, to that of causality. They would probably imagine, well, if I seek for something absolute in the chain of causality, I will seek a first cause. I will seek something that has caused the world, all the contingent things in the world, and that will then be God. But that would basically be the cosmological argument for God, about which I talked at the start of this lecture and about which I talked in the last lecture on cosmology. If that is your idea of God, if you are thinking God according only to the second relational category, according only to causality, and I would assume that this is how most people think of God, but if you think of God in that way, then really you have a quite primitive idea of God, because you are still only thinking of the God of existence, the God who, through his will, brings this world into existence. But that's just the demiurge, if he is nothing more than that. That is the God who maybe gets to decide what exists, but who doesn't get to decide what could exist, and therefore what he could bring into existence. Kant's idea of God is more deep, more radical. That is why he thinks of God according to the third category, the category of community. And here especially it becomes important to understand this category correctly. I talked about that in the lecture on the table of categories, how it's usually misunderstood, how we usually, people when reading about this category in Kant, they think of community or of mutual action. So they think of two objects independent of each other, influencing each other. And if that's how you understand this category, you will not understand what it has to do with God. I said that it is, however, better understood as the category of the whole and its parts. The parts that are necessary parts of that whole. The parts that come out of that whole, that are caused by that whole as its parts. Let me remind you that this category, if you go to the table of judgments and to my lecture on the table of judgments, this category comes from the disjunctive judgments. And what Kant says about those is that in disjunctive judgments, either or, I always have a higher concept which I am now dividing into several possible parts. So in the judgment, a human being is either dead or alive. Now, Kant is dead, so he's not alive. I take the concept of human being and I divide it into the possible parts of human beings that are alive and human beings that are dead. And what Kant would say here is that therefore the concept of a human being is a condition of the possibility of human beings being alive or being dead, right? So I could say that every human being is potentially alive or potentially dead, but I can only say that these two are possible because I have a concept of human beings. If human beings were not possible, then their being alive or their being dead would also not be possible. And I mean, it's probably enough to have a concept of something that is possible, not of something that actually exists, like human beings. Like, I could also take the concept of a unicorn, for example, and say make the disjunctive judgment that unicorns are either alive or dead. But again, I can only make that disjunctive judgment because I have concept of a unicorn. Because a unicorn is something that, even though it doesn't exist, is at least possible in my thinking. So the parts depend on the whole. The dead unicorns and the living unicorns depend on the concept of unicorn. If there was no higher concept of unicorn, then the more specific concepts of dead unicorns and living unicorns would also not be possible. And now the thing is that in all such disjunctions, the concept which I'm dividing is itself in turn a part of a higher division, right? So of course I can say all human beings are either dead or alive, but then human beings are part, for example, of the concept of mammal. I can say all mammals are either dogs or horses or mice or cats and so on, or they are human beings. And again, mammals are also part of a higher concept. They are, for example, part of living beings. So I can say a living being is either a mammal, or it's a bird, or it's a fish, and so on and so on. So always I have a higher concept that I'm dividing, and the, so to say, lower concepts, the more specific concepts, the parts, depend on the whole. And that means to Kant that there needs to be one highest concept at the top. So there needs to be a whole, which can be divided into all the parts, but which itself is not a part of a higher whole again. And that would be this concept, this idea of the most real being, of God. And that is exactly why God, in this sense, is not just the condition of things existing, because he wanted them to exist, but rather he is the condition of things even being possible, because only his essence, his being the most real being, is what makes them possible. Because I can now think of everything, whether it's something that actually exists, like a human being, or something that doesn't exist but is possible, like the unicorn. I can now think of everything as being contained within that concept of the most real being and being a part of that concept. So, like I can say in a disjunctive judgment, all human beings are either dead or alive. I can say in a disjunctive judgment, everything that has reality either has so much reality, or it has so much reality, or so much, and so on. So I can say I have this concept of absolute reality, and every other concept is that concept of absolute reality minus some degree of reality being taken away. So every being which has knowledge is the all-knowing being minus some knowledge. Every being which has power is the all-powerful being minus some degree of power. Sometimes minus more, sometimes minus less, depending on how powerful or how unpowerful that being is, but always minus some degree of power. And in that way, once again, this idea of God, which is the highest point of all disjunctions, which in the architectonic system belongs not to the category of causality and the hypothetical judgments, but rather to the category of community and the disjunctive judgments. This ideal is therefore the condition of all possibility. And I find that is a quite interesting thought that Kant has here. It's also interesting because once again you could say that Kant is getting pretty close to some sort of Spinozism here. Spinoza being the philosopher, the pantheist philosopher, who said that God and the world are basically one. Because most people, whether they are believers or whether they are atheists, most people will probably have this concept of God as being in some way separate from the world. Like being outside the world and having created the world as something which is not he. But that is really a very primitive idea of God, if you think about it. Because if God is an unlimited being, then there can't be anything outside of him. There can't be a world outside of him, because then he would have to end at some point, and the world could only start where he ends. This pantheistic notion says that the world is not outside of God. The world is either God, just identical with God, or at least is in God, as part of God. And that in a way seems to be what Kant is saying here, that God as the most real being is the whole and encompasses everything, and everything else, be it something existing or something merely possible, is a part of that that absolute reality, sharing in that reality, but only having partial reality, while God has all the reality. You could also say that Kant, who usually is thought of as a very sober thinker, and who usually is himself very much against what he in German calls Schwärmerei, so enthusiasm, any sort of mysticism. You could say that Kant here comes quite close to certain ideas of various mystical traditions, be they Kabbalistic or Sufistic or traditions of the Christian mystics. If you have any even superficial knowledge of these traditions, what I'm saying here will not sound completely unfamiliar to you. Like the mystical traditions are often influenced by Neoplatonism, and there's this sort of the world not being created, but the world emanating, so flowing out of God. And therefore, what is closer to God, to that outflow, would have more reality, would share more of God's qualities, while what is further away would share less so. There is in mysticism often the thought that everything is within God, or God is within everything. Everything has a divine core. And that, in a way, seems to be what Kant is saying, right? That God is the full reality and everything else is a limited reality, so it is a part of God. And of course, you could say that something is closer to God and something else is less close to God. And again, this would be what many more ancient philosophers, thinkers, mystics have said, that the good, the beautiful, the true has more of God in it, while the evil, the ugly, the untrue has less of God in it. So you could say that God is the full goodness or the full beauty, the full truth, and a good thing has some of that goodness. So it is godly, it is divine, but only to a degree, not fully like God Himself. A beautiful thing has some of that beauty, so it is God to a lesser degree, you could say. And then even the evil or the ugly or the lie, even they may be further away from God, they may have less reality, they may be divine to a lesser degree, so to say, but still even they in a way depend on God and are within God or have God within themselves, because you can only say they are evil and ugly and untrue by negating the full goodness and beauty and truth of God to a larger degree than you would negate them in other things, maybe, but still probably not getting to absolute zero. But even that absolute zero would depend on God in a way. You can't have a zero without a one. You need to have a concept of numbers, a concept of a quantity, to say that there's nothing here. Kant, as I said, Kant was really not a fan of the mystics and of any enthusiasm, so he himself was probably not conscious of how close he got to some of their concepts here. And indeed, in other instances, in other parts of his writings, he will contradict what I said here. He does say at some points that God is separate from the world, and the world is not within God, but created by God as being outside of Him. I will get into that more when I get to Kant's philosophy of religion, but I can already say here, and I'm not the first to say this, Fichte already said this, that Kant's philosophy of religion is probably the weakest part of his philosophy. It's probably where he was least clear and where he was most inconsistent, because he didn't clear these things up with himself properly. But anyways, let's get back to the dialectic, because as I said, this whole ideal of the most real being, according to Kant, is dialectical. So it is just an illusion. As I said before, in his pre-critical time, Kant for a time seems to have thought that the cosmological God, that the God of existence, cannot really be proven, and Kant already showed the errors in the attempted proofs for that God. But he did still think that this ideal of the most real being was necessary in order not just for existence, but even for possibility to be a thing. And therefore, he did still think that through this you could possibly prove God. Well, in his critical time, Kant in a way would still say that this ideal is necessary, but it is necessary only as an ideal. That does not mean that, it's just a thought that we have, that our reason has. That does not mean that the object of that thought, that most real being, that God, actually exists. Kant would say that possibility has two conditions, a formal and a material condition. The formal condition is simply the principle of contradiction, that old logical principle. So you can say something is possible formally if it doesn't contradict itself. Like a circle with angles contradicts itself, or a triangle with 4 angles contradicts itself, therefore it's not possible. But that's just the formal condition of possibility. Kant says there also needs to be a material condition of possibility. So one that is not concerned with the mere form, but with the content of a thing. And that material condition of possibility is the ideal of the most real being. The most real being would be a being which, of course, meets the formal criteria, doesn't self-contradict as a concept, but which also contains all the content, all the reality that a thing could contain. And then again, as I already explained, all the other things contain parts of that same content, but not the whole content. So just like the principle of contradiction is formally necessary, the ideal of the most real being is materially necessary in order for possibility to be a thing. But it is only necessary as a thought. So our reason needs it. Our reason, even if unconsciously, needs to, so to say, hold everything against that ideal and compare it with that ideal and judge how close it gets to that ideal or how far it is from it. So how much it is limited, how much reality it has, and how much reality is negated in it. We can only judge that by negating the absolute reality to certain degrees, and therefore by having an ideal of the absolute reality. But this doesn't prove that this ideal is, well, real. It is only something that we must think, at least unconsciously, and nothing more. As the critique of pure reason shows, our reason can never be transcendent, at least not without getting dialectical. It needs to stay immanent, so it needs to stay within the realm of experience. Well, even if the most real being exists, it certainly can't be experienced. We can never experience the absolute. We can only experience limited things. It would have to be a supersensual being, a being which is beyond our experience, and then we cannot know anything about it. So we can make the analytic judgment that the idea of such a being is necessary to even think limited beings. We need to have an ideal of an unlimited being. But to say that that being actually exists, that would be a synthetic judgment a priori. And as Kant shows in the Critique of Pure Reason, such synthetic judgments a priori need to still be based on viewing, on time and space. And they therefore can only be about things in time and space, not about things beyond time and space. Basically, the whole argument against this proof for God comes down to pointing out that just because we, by the nature of our reason, have to think of something in a certain way, doesn't mean that it really has to be that way. And, well, what does it mean for rational theology? It means basically the same thing which I already said about the other two fields in the last two lectures. I said that according to Kant, rational psychology can never become pneumatology. That is the science of the spirit. And I said that rational cosmology can never become metaphysical cosmology. That is the science of the supersensual world, the science of the world in itself. And just like that, Kant says, rational theology can never become theosophy, by which he understands a science of God, a science that would understand God. We cannot understand God. Just like the other two fields of metaphysics, this science too cannot become what Kant calls a doctrine. That is a positive science that expands our knowledge. We cannot have knowledge about God. We cannot understand his nature, his essence. We cannot understand what a most real being would actually be. And we cannot even understand if such a being exists or not. However, Kant does point out that even though he excludes knowledge of God, and he clearly shows that we can't have knowledge of God, that does not mean that belief in God is impossible or even ungrounded. There could still be a rational reason to believe in God even without being able to prove him. And I will talk about Kant's reason to believe in God in a future lecture when I get to his philosophy of religion. Now, what rational theology can, however, be is, like the other two fields of metaphysics, it can be not a doctrine but a discipline. That is a negative science which doesn't give us new knowledge but which prevents errors. Because Kant says, for one, it cannot prove that God exists. It can therefore not serve religion as a fundament. But if some other reason is found to still believe in God, then it can save religion from the attacks of atheism. Because rational theology can show that we really can't know anything about God. And just like we can't prove him, we cannot disprove him. So rational theology can show the errors and the illusions in all the arguments of the atheists. Because all their arguments against God are as unfounded as the arguments for God. And therefore, all the attacks on religion don't really hit their target. And also, what rational theology as a discipline can do is make sure that religion doesn't go wrong. Because Kant says, if we find another rational reason to believe in God, it must still be this idea of God as the most real being. And therefore, we can, in rational theology, so to say, analyze this idea and try to at least understand better not what it is, but what we have to think when thinking of that idea, to make sure that our belief in God does not go wrong. So, for example, we could say that there can only be one most real being. Because, I mean, it's the most real being. It's the being which contains all the reality, which is completely unlimited. There cannot be two of them, because they would then be identical. They would just be one. Elsewise, these two would have to be limited and not contain the full reality in some way. And that means that you cannot have a polytheistic religion. You need to believe in one God. Or likewise, such a most real being obviously can't be human-like. So you must not have an anthropomorphic idea of God. You can neither imagine God as this old bearded dude sitting on a throne in heaven, but you must not even have a God with an anthropomorphic psyche, like a God that gets angry and wrathful or envious. That also would not be befitting such a most real being. And that is the role that Kant sees for rational theology. So he's not saying that it should be thrown away completely and that metaphysicians should not think about God at all, but they should, they should be a bit more humble. They should not try to prove God or to find out God's nature, because that simply goes beyond what we can do with our reason. All they should do is not a doctrine, but a discipline that prevents wrong opinions about God, and that also doesn't prove religion, but can at least shield and protect religion against atheistic attacks, and therefore make sure that if we have another reason for belief in God, at least that belief is not shaken up, and at least we don't get doubts about that belief, even though we cannot positively prove it. But with that, I get to the end of the dialectic. That was the third of the three fields of metaphysics that Kant criticizes in the Critique of Pure Reason. And in the next lecture, I want to give one more overview over that whole thing and ask the question, so what is the result of it all? What are we left with? If reason becomes dialectical, when, as it always does, because that is its nature, that is its desire, when it ventures into the supersensual, then what can our reason do? What is it good for? That is what I want to talk about in the upcoming lecture. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklären cause.